You can bring in the best technology in the world, but if you don't have people who are lined up behind this vision that you have for your digital transformation, or they have a culture where they're not willing to work together or be agile, technology will fail.
This is the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell and Associates, a Newport Beach, California-based ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. The ERP OCJ seeks to share expertise, insight, experience, and research, and to create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success. And now, here's your ERP expert and host, the founder of Nestell and Associates, Dr. Jack Nestell.
Hey, Jack here. The Enterprise Resource Planning, or ERP, organizational change landscape and future is exciting. As history demonstrates, all things ERP organizational change will continue to evolve. I think we agree that successful ERP organizational change requires that the appropriate emphasis is placed on all three aspects of the triad: people, processes, and technology. But advancements in technology and emerging technologies will certainly reset the table. But how exactly? And what does that mean to your organization? Let's discuss the trends, possibilities, and future of ERP organizational change and digital transformation as a result of technology. On today's episode, we discuss the title of our guest and colleague's book, Digital Transformation Using Emerging Technologies, with Mr. Fawad Khan. We focus on the technology pillar of the triad to examine emerging technologies and its impact in digital transformation. Mr. Khan is a digital transformation and cloud leader, emerging technologies expert, author, keynote speaker, and educator, where he is also an adjunct faculty at the University of Washington. Mr. Khan has been with Microsoft for 16 years, where he is currently a digital community and social leader and is an expert in product innovation and development, community building, customer and partner engagement, supportability, technical readiness, training, and customer support across multiple cloud organizations in Microsoft, including Office 365, Azure, and Dynamics 365. He is also a co-author of Digital Transformation Using Emerging Technologies, a CXO's Guide to Transform Your Organization, which is the topic of this conversation today. He is a co-author with Jason Anderson. Joining us from Seattle, Washington, Fawad, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jack. It's great to be here, and I'm excited about talking to you about emerging technologies and digital transformation.
Likewise, we're very excited to have you with us today and share your insight. So I can't wait. Before we get started, Fawad, just for fun, I want to quickly share with our listeners a list of technologies that are emerging or rapidly advancing. And of course, we will not be discussing all of these today, but just for the fun of it, I'll share these with our listeners. 3D printing, 5G, artificial intelligence as a service, augmented reality, biotechnology, Bitcoin, big data, blockchain, brain-computer interfaces, cloud and edge computing, computer vision, cryptocurrency, cybersecurity advances, digital operations platforms, digital twins, facial recognition, high-temperature superconductors, intelligent automation, intelligent spaces, Internet of Things, machine learning, machine creativity and augmented design, nanotechnology, natural language processing, quantum computing, re-decentralizing corporate information infrastructures, that one's getting attention, RFID or radio frequency identification, robotic process automation, silicon versus carbon-based computing systems, tactile virtual reality, ultra capacitors, virtual reality, voice interfaces, wearable technology. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. That's pretty interesting stuff, Fawad.
I know, Jack. So I don't talk about all those technologies in the book, but I do take a few of the key ones that are definitely making a difference for organizations, big and small, and how they transform and evolve their business models and move forward as a much more efficient organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, operational efficiencies. Um, so, Fawad, the first question I have is if you could share with our listeners, how would you define digital transformation?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think before you go and start using something, it is important to understand the basics. And to me, digital transformation is basically using evolving and emerging technologies and bringing change in your organization. So the change can be in your processes, in your operations, or even evolving your business models. So there are some key drivers for this. You might have competitive pressure. I mean, there's higher customer expectation, or you see growth for revenue going up for you, and those are some of the key things that drive you to have digital transformation. And it is all about using digital technologies to make sure that you are being efficient, you're being competitive, and you're growing your business.
So that was the next question I had for you is, obviously, there's a benefit and a return on investment for digital transformation. Otherwise, organizations wouldn't do it. But can you maybe drill down just a little bit further in terms of the biggest benefits of a digital transformation? So obviously, it's about increased business performance at the end of the day. But can you maybe discuss that a little bit further?
Yeah, I think I should also mention that digital transformation doesn't necessarily have to be for external customers. It can be for internal employees too.
Yeah.
And you want to use technology as an example. And I'll just give you a very simple example. Chatbots is something that is being utilized quite a bit is by companies on different channels where they communicate with the customers. And you can automate communication with the customer using a chatbot. You don't need to have a live person available through that channel. The channel can be a website as an, and you are able to answer customer questions, and you are able to help them 24/7, 365 days a year. Another key benefits, I would say, would be improvements of internal employee experience, giving them the right set of tools so
Mm.
they can help customers, as an example, or right set of tools where they can be more efficient in getting their tasks done. There can also be an opportunity for you as an organization to say, hey, can we use any one of these technologies? I'll take AI as an example, artificial intelligence, and see, hey, can we build a product or a service which we can offer to our customers and grow our profits or grow our revenue at the end of the day?
So, Fuad, then let me flip that question. Obviously, there's great benefits to an organization in terms of return on investment and organizational performance, but at the same time, just the economics of it, right? It doesn't come for free. So there's time, money, and effort that goes into these digital transformations. But what are some of the greatest risks and challenges that go along with a digital transformation? Would you say?
Yeah, great question, by the way. And I think you can't just jump into something without understanding the risks and challenges, and also looking at the future of that too, what you are getting into. So, a couple of things I would say, or more than couple, I'm going to talk about. One is, as an organization, you, especially if you are a large organization or an enterprise, you got to have a cohesive vision and strategy. In a large organization, you have heard that scenario, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Yeah.
You get into that quite a bit. And a
Mm.
lot of units or departments within a large organization will start doing their own thing. They will spin up projects and initiatives without understanding the overall vision that the company has or the business goals. So it is important that you do take a top down approach, but that's not the only approach. And this can be a topic by itself. You definitely need to do
Yeah.
bottoms up too, but you need to have support from the top and make sure that every unit is, first of all, aligned on the vision and the strategy that you're going to take to digitally transform. So that is one important piece. The second, which to me is probably the most important along with vision, is culture and people. If you don't
Yeah.
have the right culture within an organization and you don't have people aligned with that digital transformation vision, you're going to fail, unfortunately. So, culture can be around fear, it can be around uncertainty, it can be around you not being agile to stay competitive, or it can be just around that the different units within an organization don't work with each other that well. And that definitely can lead to disaster. So, a third one I want to throw out there, especially key for large organizations, again, is lack of executive management and sponsorship. I talked about the scenario, Jack, where you might have different units doing their own thing. And even if you start something and it's the greatest idea since the internet, I want to call it, but if you don't have executive management or sponsorship from the top, you will not be able to carry through this initiative successfully. So that's another
Yeah.
key thing I have seen in large organizations. A lot of people have great ideas. A lot of departments do end up doing projects, but they don't go anywhere because nobody at the top of the chain knew that there was a project going on or what the concept was all about.
That's just a fascinating insight. So true. Fawad, I do want to ask you. So, as you'd mentioned, there's technology, and then you just mentioned several different components that I would call people components of a project, right? In fact, Nestell and Associates, and just within the practice in general, we often talk about the ERP organizational change triad, which includes people, processes, and technology from the highest level. So, how do you think emerging technologies will affect this triad? And Fawad, if you really think about this, at least for me, this is a pretty fascinating question. If you look at the historical advancements in technology brought to organizations through digital transformation and ERP organizational change, this is a pretty significant, legitimate, and frankly fun question. So, what will emerging technology do for digital transformation success? Or let me ask this again, or maybe in a different way. Ultimately, if technology doesn't really contribute or factor into ERP organizational change, mission, and success, how valuable is the technology then?
Right. And I think you hit the nail on the head here. Bringing those three factors, technology, people, and processes, and all of them work together. As I mentioned, you can bring in the best technology in the world, but if you don't have people who are lined up behind this vision that you have for your digital transformation, or they have a culture where they're not willing to work together or be agile, technology will fail. The best of the technology will fail. And there are many examples you can go get references on where organizations did try to bring in the best technology, but the people were not aligned on, or they did not have a buy in into that technology and didn't want to work together. And that just totally everything failed. That's one of the key things I highlight in my book too on some of
Yeah.
the projects that have failed. So, processes, I think when you bring in new technology, processes change. Now, one of the key reasons that you might be bringing technology or emerging technologies is to improve processes both internally and maybe improve the processes and even externally as you communicate and engage with your customers. So processes will change. Obviously, bringing in new technology also means that you will have to have training that you need to think through on. You want to train your customers, you want to train your internal employees, not only on the technology, but on the new processes. And again, I do want to touch on people again because that is such a key factor in successful digital transformation, that
Yeah.
people have to be aligned with your vision if you're leading digital transformation in an organization.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just think what will be fun to examine over the coming years is whether or not the shift in how this dynamic and complex relationship between people, processes, and technology changes. So, it's just fun to consider how technology will make up for gaps, challenges and risk within the people and process components of that triad. I think emerging technologies have a lot to offer. So
Absolutely.
fascinating idea. So, Fawad, my next question is going to be along the lines of how will technology impact what we call true differentiators, right? So, that is, what will emerging technologies contribute to software and ERP vendors and their platforms in terms of what we call, or Nestell and Associates, anyways, calls these true differentiators? And we've written about the value of digital transformation solutions in general and ERP system selection specifically. explaining that there's only one right fit for every organization. And in fact, we had a post called Private Equity Portfolio ERP Success, the Value of Enterprise Resource Planning, True Differentiators, in which we discussed how there's only one best fit. There's only one best ERP solution for each organization. And the article emphasized how research strongly suggests that ERP systems and technology selection are critical influence for successful ERP organizational change project. Any thoughts on that idea and maybe how emerging technologies can become a true differentiator across different vendors?
Yeah, definitely, Jack. So I did look at the article, and I really liked what it had to offer and how it talked about true differentiators. I think when you get into some major change that you want to bring into organization, I think you do want to understand, again, going back to the basics and saying what's your vision, and then what is going to be your strategy, and what vendor do you want to bring to the table, and how can this vendor help you with this triad of technology, people, and processes. I think that's definitely key. And
Yeah.
differentiation is also achieved via products, quality of service, new technology that is going to solve a business problem. Now, this business problem, as I had mentioned before, can be either getting a competitive edge or evolving your business model and growing your business, or it can be just improving your internal efficiency in how you do day-to-day operations. So definitely technology can be key in helping you with all of these factors.
Absolutely. Well, Fuad, now I would like to review your book with you a little bit. And for our listeners, the book and the link is included in our show notes. And in fact, I'd like to do this chapter by chapter, if you don't mind, over the next 4 or 5
Oh,
questions.
Jack will be
Um,
here all day then.
yeah, exactly. But a really interesting book, and I highly recommend our listeners to take a look at your book for sure. But I would like to share some specific technologies in a little more detail. And so, for each one of these, if you would please maybe just share with our listeners from a high level, what role do you think these technologies will ultimately play? Or what role do you think these technologies are or will play in supporting ERP organizational change success? So I think we'll have some fun exploring each of these and understanding what impact each will or will not have on the future of ERP organizational change and digital transformation. And just for our listeners, I think that some of these are pretty cool technologies that are highly relevant to ERP. And some vendors are even starting to brand, package, and market their quote unquote next generation ERP and quote unquote transformational software, which is really leveraging some emerging technologies. So, in general, Fawad, ERP vendors are using these next generation to mean the integration of emerging technologies and advanced technology coupled with industry best practices. So, I definitely like to drill down on some of these different emerging technologies for a moment with our listeners. So, the first one is, Fawad, what can you share about the future of cloud computing, and what can you share about the core service model and benefits for transforming legacy IT to cloud?
Right. And let me first just make a statement saying who is not using the cloud nowadays.
Yeah, right.
We have gone through a really bad pandemic. Still, some areas of the world is still going through it. And I tell you, it is the cloud that has saved the day. I mean, even when you look at the market, when you look at big companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they just shrugged off the pandemic because of the technologies they had to offer to their customers so that the business keeps running. Doesn't matter where the employees were, but because of having cloud computing, we were able to run the business with minimal disruption. Sure, some industries will affected more than that, but definitely cloud saved the day. There are key things I want to touch on a couple of things that are definitely key for, or rather relate to legacy IT, and as they move to the cloud. We have come a long way from 2010. AWS had to offer their cloud offering first time. There was this notion of lift and shift. You lift your workload, you put it in the cloud, and then you go change. And that was one
Yeah.
of the first few scenarios. For small businesses, it was never a question of where they wanted to have their infrastructure. They started in the cloud. But for enterprise IT, there are a couple of trends that are happening that are very key and important to understand. The first one is a hybrid cloud. Mid to large enterprises are connecting their on premises networks and their private networks to the public cloud. and extending their network and running some of their workloads in the cloud now. Most of their workloads run on the on-premises infrastructure, but they are slowly moving some non-critical workloads into the cloud. And as time goes by, we're going to see business critical workloads also moved into the cloud. That's one trend. Hybrid cloud is growing, and hybrid cloud does increase complexity, but it also provides opportunities for the talent to be hired to maintain such a complex network. The second trend is towards multi cloud. A lot of companies, large organizations, mid to large, I would say, are using multiple public cloud vendors. So a company can decide to go with both Azure Cloud and AWS Cloud. I was looking at this report from Flexera, State of the Cloud of 2021,
Mm.
and of the people they surveyed, 92% of the organization surveyed that they were using multi-cloud. They had multiple public cloud providers at the same time. The last trend I want to talk about, which is going to become very prominent in upcoming years when you talk about the cloud, is low code and no code. Up to this point, Microsoft, I'll talk about Microsoft, has offered Power Platform, Dynamics. You have other competitors like APN, and Amazon is also offering Honeycode and Salesforce. But more and more companies are going to be using these low code, no code platforms to build applications in house without bringing in a hardcore developer, but having the power users within a unit or within a department building apps. I was looking at a Gartner number. They are predicting that 65% of all application starting in 2024 will be done with these lower platforms. So those are some key trends we are going to see. Just for the regular cloud, I'll throw one in there. I told you lift and shift as one of the trends that we started with. Now it's moving more towards building cloud native applications. So using technologies like serverless, using tools like containers, that's where the trend is going to. So we have gone from lift and shift to primarily using cloud tools to build cloud native applications.
So, Fawad, since you are employed by Microsoft, can you dive more into specifically Azure Cloud and maybe outline the key services and tools it offers? Some up and coming evolution of Azure.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I have to tell you, I love Azure. When I learned about cloud computing, I learned about Azure first, although I was in Office 365 organization at that time, but I also teach Azure courses at University of Washington. So I think some of the core services, Jack, that companies started with, or Azure offers, and other cloud providers also offer, include Azure VM virtual machines or Azure App Services. And these are very common core services that system administrators, network administrators, and developers use. And this second set of services would be around the developer. We are seeing integration of tools. Now you have Visual Studio for .NET developers who might have been legacy .NET developers. Then we bring in VS Code for all the open source enthusiasts, and now along with that, we are bringing in GitHub. So this combination and integration of different tools and services is at least Microsoft is really proud of in the Azure world, that we are able to offer tools and services from front end to back end to full stack developer. Doesn't matter who you are, and we will help you build those cloud native applications that we were talking about. Uh, Another thing to also consider is that Azure is not this closed-ended system, or traditionally many years back, Microsoft was known for being a black box, especially with our operating system. We do have a thriving marketplace, Azure Marketplace, where we offer third-party vendors to come and put their solutions, and our customers can pick their open source solutions and utilize them in their systems and their applications that you're building. And again, touching on what Azure has to offer, Azure does offer cloud native technologies like containers and serverless. so you can continue to build the latest and greatest cloud applications in Azure. One thing that really is really nice about Azure, and for that matter, for any cloud provider, you go to AWS or Google, is that these cloud providers are the ones offering key emerging technologies or the services or the tools for these key emerging technologies. So Azure offers Machine Learning Studio, which is a tool or a portal you can use to build machine learning based apps. You have AI platform that Microsoft offers. You have IoT offerings. You have blockchain offering. When you consider emerging technologies and you want to use those emerging technologies as an organization, I think it would be really beneficial to think about, hey, who is that vendor we can go to who can help us give us an end-to-end solution? Because as an organization, as you're building any solution, it is very hard to manage five or six vendors. Going with
Yeah.
one vendor, getting the end to end technology and tools will make everybody's job easier end of the day.
Yeah.
So those are some of the key things that Azure offers.
Great points. Thanks, Fawad. Fawad, you have a chapter in your book, I think, pretty much dedicated to machine learning. Can you share with our listeners what exactly is machine learning? But then what are the possible benefits for the organization? And the flip side of that coin, what are the challenges and maybe the future of machine learning, or maybe the challenges of the future use of machine learning?
Yeah, definitely. I think machine learning is all about computer systems or machines able to predict or forecast, suggest or provide an answer for a question for which they have not been explicitly programmed to do so. So machine learning is nothing more than a bunch of algorithms. You're talking about statistical and mathematical algorithms that are taking the data and then coming up with some kind of answer, and there's no explicit programming done to give a certain kind of an answer that a regular computer program does. And these machine learning models are part of what we call our AI system. So if somebody says, I have an AI application, most probably underneath that, there's some machine learning model, which is, as I said, a bunch of algorithms that can take the data, analyze the data, and then give you an output. And some of the key things that machine learning models do are obviously you need to feed data into them. This has to be historic data from organization, and then they will give an answer. And then once this machine learning model has been trained on some historical data, then you can feed any kind of data and it will either predict or forecast or give you an answer with a different data set. So you can deploy it as a web service.
So, Fawad, you had mentioned the idea of artificial intelligence. What exactly is artificial intelligence and how is that different from machine learning? But then, what are the possible benefits and use cases of artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
And maybe, Fawad, if you could share with our listeners, we do get a lot of questions, and I have people asking me all the time that are maybe a bit apprehensive about where we're headed with artificial intelligence. But what can you say in terms of AI governance, responsible AI, and maybe technical advancements of AI? Because we're currently using, and when I say we, I mean the human race is using artificial intelligence clearly. But what do you see as some of the most significant advancements in AI? So that was a pretty loaded question, but if you
Yeah,
want to
I'll try to
attack
break it
that,
down.
if you could, yeah, fantastic.
Definitely, and this Jack. This is a very very relevant question
Yeah.
as we are having this conversation here. Um, I think I did mention that underneath, when somebody says, I have an AI application, underneath that, you have what is called some kind of a machine learning model, which is nothing more than an algorithm, statistical and mathematical algorithms that can take the data and provide some kind of answer. Now, once you deploy this machine learning model, you can deploy it as an API endpoint, as an example. And then you can build a web app on top of that, which can, in the background, go to this API endpoint, provide it some input, and it gives an answer to you. That's the simplest AI application you have. And if you go further down underneath machine learning, a lot of organizations also use deep learning is how the brain works. So we are trying to see if we can have the machines think like the brain thinks. So, in conclusion, what I want to say is that any AI system is either using a machine learning model or a deep learning, which is how a human brain works with neurons connected. So that's what AI is. Now, AI is built into many things that we use without even realizing. I'll give you a quick example. When you use LinkedIn and when you are chatting or messaging someone, you have noticed how it makes suggestions. So I was using LinkedIn chat with someone and I said, would you like to connect and discuss this more? And suddenly I saw an option. It said, do you want to start a video call right now? So it gave me an option where, or auto suggested something where it's understanding what I'm saying and it's giving me possible answers that I can give. And it also does the same for the other person as you're having conversations. AI is also used quite a bit in email spam detection and security filtering. If you have used Microsoft Word, when Word is doing autocorrection, it has a built in machine learning model which knows that certain sentences are spelled this way, certain grammar has to be constructed in this way, so it makes suggestion to you. You've seen autocomplete in Google, right? It
Yeah.
tries to find your intent when you're typing. As an example, if I type Azure AI use cases, if I type Azure AI, it'll give me suggestions because it has data already. It has been trained. The machine learning model underneath that Google search has been trained to let it figure out what are some of the most common questions that might come. Another example is facial recognition. If you have a Windows machine, you have facial recognition. Windows Hello is an option you can turn on for logging into your Windows machine. It recognizes your face. There are a lot of APIs available, AI APIs that Microsoft offers or AWS or Google offer, where you can connect to these APIs and do facial recognition or recognize a certain kind of an animal between a cat and a dog, as an example. So those are some of the use cases. I do want to touch on your question around some of the basic concepts around governance because
Yeah.
it is important that when you are building machine learning and AI systems, because underneath AI, as I mentioned multiple times, you have those machine models. You want to be careful that you might introduce bias and ethical issues within your AI systems. And two reasons, without getting more into detail, I would love to have you go read my book, but two reasons how bias gets into AI system is via the data that was used to train the model and also the algorithm you are using. That these two things do affect if there is bias in your AI systems. An AI system can become biased against certain groups, minorities, or marginalized communities, and you definitely want to avoid that. There have been some examples of justice system, financial systems that were using AI that made some decisions that were biased against certain minorities or certain groups. So it's important that you understand the data, you understand the algorithm, and make sure you test your system so it doesn't introduce any societal biases around age, gender, your sexual orientation, ethnicity, race, religion, disability, or your socioeconomic status. One example, there was an resume analyzer system that Amazon was using, which was biased against all the women resumes that were coming in and the woman candidates. So they scrapped that system and get rid. And one more system that is used quite a bit in the industry is in financial services. If you have an AI-based system that is processing loans, it can deny loans for certain groups or certain minorities. So you want to make sure you understand what your AI system is doing underneath the covers. I know it was a loaded question, so I want to make
Yeah.
sure I
No, this
touch
is
on
great. This
all,
is fascinating.
yeah. One last thing on governance. You talked about that, Jack. And my book has I think around 7 to 10 factors, but I want to touch on three just to give you a taste of the governance that you need to have built around your AI applications or system. First one is fairness. You want to make sure your system has fairness and it doesn't go and makes biased decision on any of the factors I mentioned around age, gender, ethnicity, etc. The second one is that it should be reliable and safe. If there is an AI system built and is monitoring, let's suppose, a chemical plant, you want to make sure it's reliable, it can make predictions. And if it was measuring toxicity of certain chemicals, it is able to reliably predict it, and then we can take measures and make sure we keep our workers safe. So, reliability and safety is important. Human assessment is another factor. Look, AI systems is not a science. To me, it's a hybrid of science and an art. And you
Mm.
got to make sure that when you build an AI system, you are testing it. And while you're training the AI system or the machine learning model underneath the AI system, you are a human assesses all the answers that the AI system is going to provide and make sure that it is not doing anything unusual or anomalous when it's giving out those answers. And you want to test it out with different kinds of data sets that you want into your AI system to make sure you build a system that is fair and not biased.
Yeah, AI is a fascinating technology and even to a certain degree concept yet, and it's going to be just really interesting to see where AI takes us. And it reminds me, Fawad, of a book I read. I believe it was published in the early '90s, and it was called "Mind, Machines, and Human Consciousness." And I think it was Robert Nadeau. Not sure if you heard of that book, but I remember reading it, and this was right after a couple years after I graduated from high school, actually. And in the book, and I think he was quoting somebody else, but I remember this quote that said, "Someday man is going to be to robots, our dogs are to man today."
Scary.
and and the whole idea with that is in the context of AI, of artificial intelligence. And I think people hear that, and this whole idea of you meet people who are just they think AI is the best thing ever and it's going to save mankind, and maybe it will. But then there's the very opposite end of that extreme spectrum where it scares people to death, where they say it's going to be the end of mankind. Um, so it really is a pretty fascinating technology for sure. And it's certainly still evolving. And it'll be curious to see the use cases and how it's applied down the road.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You mentioned that AI is not something. So the the concept has been there since 1950s. I mean,
Yeah.
we have talked about it. It's important to understand why suddenly the interest. I won't say hype. I think we are 2 years past that hype period on AI. I think the thing with AI now is that cloud providers like Microsoft, Amazon, and Google have democratized this technology so much. And it's like a commodity now that you can purchase because back in 90s and 80s all these financial services companies they were using AI to predict stocks and monitor stocks and make decisions, but these organizations had deep pockets. They could spend money to have those large compute resources or data centers where their AI models could do the computations in almost real time and provide answers. Not every company had those resources at that time, but with the cloud now, you have that compute power. Even if you are a small company, you are a startup, you want to build an AI app, but you need the compute power and you don't have to go and set up your own data center or go buy 20 computers, really high end computers. Just go with a cloud vendor like Microsoft or Amazon or Google and
Yeah.
get the compute power and do your AI.
Fascinating. Um, so, Fawad, I have another question, which is a topic of one of your chapters, and it's something that you hear a lot of people talk about these days, and more so over the last couple of years, especially. But the quote unquote the Internet of Things. What are some of the business value and use cases with the Internet of Things, and what are some of the potential Internet of Things challenges that you see?
Yeah, definitely. I think, first of all, Internet of Things is basically just before I provide an answer on the business value is it's basically your things or devices connected, and these devices, connected devices, are generating data. Now, these devices might be monitoring temperature, as an example, temperature within a factory, temperature, the outside temperature, whatever. whatever reading you have that you want to capture, it's monitoring that. Usually a device and has a bunch of sensors on it: humidity sensor, pressure sensor, temperature sensors. And these sensors are collecting data, and this data is then being processed in the cloud. So it's sent back into the cloud and it's processed. And then looking at the data, you make a business decision. So if the data shows some anomaly suddenly, so as an example, we had a temperature sensing device and the normal temperature was 50 degrees. Suddenly we see temperature coming back as 70 degrees from this device. So what do? You need to shut down this device? Do you need to remotely reboot this device? Do you need to send a technician to where this device is and have them take a look at it and take care of the problem? So that's the key concept behind it. I don't want to go into edge computing where instead of getting the data into the cloud, the data is being processed right where close to where the device is, but that's another variation of IoT. But the whole idea is devices with sensors generating data, data traveling back to the cloud, getting processed, and then you making some kind of a business decision. So that's in a nutshell what IoT is all about. Now, the business value behind IoT can be, look, remote monitoring and management is one of those. And I gave you an example of temperature sensing device. Predictive maintenance is a second key use case where if we see some anomalous data coming back, we can dispatch a technician, as an example, and go take a look at that device before it creates bigger problems, right? So that's another example. The third example would be a connected factory where you have IoT devices and you can monitor your factory through a dashboard where all the data is being sent into the cloud and getting processed. And you can figure out if some part of the factory is working properly, if some devices are going down, or there are some issues with devices. So it helps with that, especially in the manufacturing sector. You can have enhanced supply chain management processes, especially relevant to ERP, right, Jack?
Yeah.
And supply chain is a big problem nowadays as we speak too,
Yeah, absolutely.
where you have devices that monitor the product from the factory floor where it was created to where it was shipped, coming to a warehouse, to traveling to a customer's, to either a retail store or coming to a customer's doorsteps. All that can be monitored with IoT. So it definitely helps with logistics, definitely helps with your end-to-end supply chain management processes.
Fascinating, fascinating stuff. So, Fawad, this question here is probably one of my favorites. And we do ask this, I think, to every guest for every podcast so far, because at the end of the day, we're about collaborative learning. And so, when it comes to digital transformation and ERP implementation, what words of advice or any key advice that you would offer up to our listeners in terms of emerging tech in general? So, if you could summarize your work experience in your book and your skill set in regards to emerging technologies, what would you offer up to our listeners?
Yeah, great question. And I think, Jack, when I look at digital transformation, and I want to go back to when we started this conversation too, I think understanding before you get on to this journey, understanding what your vision and goals are is extremely important. That is key. The second thing is just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean that you have to do it too.
Mm,
That what should drive you to digitally transform is if you want to solve a business problem, or if you feel like or not feel like, or if there is a business opportunity that you feel like you can get to, that's where you bring in these emerging technologies. And it's important. The third point I want to make is it is important that you have a buy-in from the people. If you miss that core part of people and culture within an organization, and you just bring in technology to start your journey, you have chances of failing unless and until you have buy-in from the people and you have top-down support from your executive management.
Great insight, Fawad. Fantastic. I love that answer. Fawad, thank you so much for your time today. We truly appreciate your work. And for our listeners, please be sure to grab your copy of Fawad's book, and that's titled Digital Transformation Using Emerging Technologies, a CXO's Guide to Transform Your Organization. Fawad, thank you again. Thank you so much for your time. Be well, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Jack. And I really appreciate you setting up this podcast for us to have this important conversation, because this is so relevant as we speak about digital transformation in today's age as businesses evolve. And even through the pandemic, it has been such a big driver for companies to rethink on what technologies they were using and how they need to evolve to stay competitive.
Absolutely. Such a highly relevant topic, that's to be sure. Fawad, thank you again, my friend, and we'll be in touch.
Great. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you. You
Bye.
bet. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the ERP OCJ podcast. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change successes and challenges. We discuss the people, process, and technological components of ERP organizational change by drawing on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience. We are incredibly grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us in our podcast as we seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community and contribute to its success by bringing research and practice closer together. We want to make sure this is the most useful and insightful ERP podcast you listen to, and we'd love your help in doing so by leaving us feedback and a review. A great place to do so is at Apple Podcasts. Just click on the Listen in Apple Podcasts link, then click Ratings and Reviews, and let us know your thoughts. You can get more info about the show, including show notes and episode highlights for this and all of our episodes, by visiting nestleandassociates.com and clicking the podcast option. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. And don't forget to follow us on social media, #TheERPOCJ. Thanks again for listening. Have a fantastic week.